I had always thought my life was simple, predictable, comfortable in its quiet rhythm. My name is Alex, and for the past 3 years, I had been with Daniel, someone dependable, steady, the kind of partner who felt like home, but perhaps a little too much like home. Our routines had settled into a cadence that left little room for surprise, little room for the sparks I secretly craved. I told myself I was content, that love was measured in stability, in shared bills and Sunday morning coffee, but deep inside, there was a restless part of me, whispering that something was missing. It was a Thursday evening when everything began to shift. I had decided to go to the gym after work, a habit I claimed was for fitness but secretly also served as a mental escape. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the scent of sweat and antiseptic filled the air, a strangely comforting combination. As I adjusted the weights for a set of dumbbell presses, I noticed him, a man with a presence that made the room feel a little smaller, a little hotter. His name, I would later learn, was Marcus. Marcus was impossible to ignore. Broad shoulders, a sculpted chest, muscles that seemed to have been carved with intention, not accident. But it wasn't just his physique, it was the way he moved. Every step was measured yet effortless, every glance seemed to land somewhere between casual interest and deliberate invitation. He smiled as he noticed me noticing him, a small tilt of the lips that hinted at amusement, challenge, and something darker I couldn't yet name. I returned to my routine, pretending the weights were more compelling than they really were. My hands trembled slightly, not from the effort of lifting, but from the sudden awareness of him. Marcus approached without urgency, as if we were the only 2 people in the gym despite the buzz of machines and muffled music. "Hey," he said, voice low but warm. "Haven't seen you here before. Name's Marcus." "Alex," I replied, and for the first time in a long while, my own name sounded strange in my mouth, like it belonged to someone else, someone capable of something bolder than the life I had been leading. We talked casually at first, about the gym, routines, favorite workouts. Yet beneath the surface, every word seemed charged. There was a playful energy in his tone, a teasing that hinted at intimacy without crossing any line, yet the line trembled at the thought of crossing it. I felt an unexpected thrill, a rush that had nothing to do with exercise. My chest tightened, not from lifting, but from awareness of the temptation standing before me. Marcus gestured toward the weight rack with a confident ease. "You lift like someone who knows what they're doing. Want to see a trick?" he asked. Before I could respond, he picked up a pair of dumbbells and demonstrated a complex set, muscles flexing in precise synchrony. I watched, captivated, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and desire. Every controlled motion seemed to communicate something unsaid, a silent invitation that was impossible to misread. "You make it look effortless," I admitted, trying to sound composed. My voice betrayed me slightly, softer than intended. He chuckled, a sound that was warm but carried a subtle edge, like he knew the effect he had. "It's all about control," he said, brushing a bead of sweat from his temple. "Control over your body, and sometimes over other things." The words lingered in the air, and my pulse quickened. Control over other things. I wondered briefly what he meant, but also, dangerously, I didn't want to know yet. The conversation shifted, but never fully lost its undercurrent of tension. We joked about diet, workouts, and trivial frustrations. And yet, every smile he offered felt like it was aimed directly at me, like it held promises I wasn't supposed to hear. I caught myself glancing at the door, considering leaving, considering returning to my safe, predictable life, but the thought of leaving felt heavier than staying. After what felt like an eternity compressed into minutes, Marcus leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "I just moved into a new place nearby. Want to come see it? I have a small setup for post-workout protein shakes, nothing fancy, but it's cozy." My mind raced. Daniel was waiting for me at home, expecting me to come back with my usual tired smile, not the disquieted one I now wore. And yet, something inside me, a curiosity I hadn't acknowledged, a desire I had buried under years of routine, whispered, "Yes. Just see it. Just one moment." I hesitated, weighing loyalty against longing, responsibility against excitement. The gym seemed suddenly too ordinary, the fluorescent lights too harsh. Marcus's presence was a magnetic pull I couldn't resist, drawing me into a world that promised both thrill and danger. I nodded, almost mechanically, saying, "Sure, why not?" His smile widened, and it was in that smile that I felt the first unmistakable thrill of crossing a line I hadn't dared approach in years. He extended his hand, strong and confident, and I took it, feeling the warmth, the pressure, the subtle assertion of dominance that made my stomach twist deliciously with anticipation. As we left the gym together, I kept stealing glances at him. Every step we took felt loaded with possibility, every unspoken word a thread pulling me further away from the life I thought I knew. The streets passed in a blur, yet every detail seemed sharper. Streetlights casting shadows that seemed to whisper secrets, the evening air heavy with unspoken promises. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly awake. Every rational thought screamed caution, every memory of Daniel pressed against my conscience. Yet beneath it all, a darker, more insistent part of me whispered, "Adventure waits. Desire waits." And tonight, the predictable life I had clung to would pause, just long enough for something dangerous, irresistible, and utterly forbidden to begin. By the time we reached Marcus's building, I realized with a mixture of fear and exhilaration that I had already crossed the threshold. Not the door to his apartment yet, but the threshold of choice. There was no turning back to the person I had been before tonight. And in that awareness, I understood the unspoken truth. This night would change everything, whether I was ready or not. The elevator ride to Marcus's floor felt interminable. Every ding of the ascending numbers echoed in my chest, a reminder that I was stepping into uncharted territory. My hands, clammy from nerves, or perhaps anticipation, clutched the strap of my gym bag a little too tightly. Marcus stood beside me, casual, almost indifferent, yet there was an undercurrent of energy that seemed to hum around him, a quiet electricity that made the small space of the elevator feel charged. He glanced at me once, just long enough to notice my tension, and smiled. That smile, confident and knowing, made my stomach flutter with an unfamiliar mix of anxiety and thrill. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by the subtle scent of his apartment. Cedarwood, fresh linen, and something faintly spicy that I couldn't place but found arresting. The living space was small but meticulously arranged, nothing ostentatious, yet every detail suggested care and taste. A single bookshelf held an assortment of titles, mostly biographies and fitness manuals, alongside a few novels I recognized. On the wall above a sleek leather couch hung a large framed photograph of Marcus at a competition, his lean torso glistening with sweat, the expression on his face proud but approachable. Even framed and frozen, he radiated presence. "Make yourself comfortable," Marcus said, gesturing toward the couch. He moved with ease, a natural fluidity that suggested he had inhabited confidence for years. I sat down cautiously, aware of every subtle movement I made, aware of how closely my attention followed him. Marcus returned with 2 protein shakes, setting them on the small coffee table between us. "I don't usually make them for guests," he admitted, a faint laugh in his voice. "But tonight seems like an exception." His eyes held mine briefly, and for a moment, the room seemed smaller than it was, as if we were suspended in a private orbit separate from the rest of the world. I took the shake with slightly trembling hands, the liquid cold against my skin and strangely grounding. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than intended. I wasn't sure if the softness reflected nervousness or something more primal, the pull of his presence, the unspoken possibility in the room. We talked at first about banalities, the gym, routines, and mutual acquaintances we discovered we shared. Yet beneath the casual chatter, there was a magnetic tension, a subtle undercurrent of intimacy. Every time he leaned slightly forward, or his hand brushed against mine as he reached for his shake, my pulse jumped. I became painfully aware of the gap between my usual controlled self and the version of me that existed when Marcus was near, a version more impulsive, more daring, and alarmingly receptive to temptation. "You have a way of listening," Marcus said after a pause, tilting his head as though weighing my words. "Not many people do these days. Most are too busy talking about themselves." His tone wasn't flattery. It was observation. The simplicity of the comment made me realize how starved I had been for connection that felt genuinely attentive. I laughed softly, shaking my head. Maybe I just enjoy paying attention when someone actually makes it interesting. The words sounded braver than I expected. He smiled again, that slow, measured smile that seemed to make ordinary air feel warmer. As the evening wore on, conversation drifted into personal territory. Marcus spoke of his childhood, the discipline that had sculpted both his body and mindset, and the solitude that came with such devotion. There was a vulnerability in his voice that contrasted sharply with the confident exterior he carried in public. I found myself listening, captivated not just by his stories, but by the ease with which he shared himself with me, an openness that contrasted with the careful boundaries I maintained with Daniel. The lighting in his apartment had dimmed, shadows softening corners and giving the room a more intimate, almost secretive quality. I realized with a shiver that the physical closeness we had maintained in the gym, the incidental touches, the casual proximity, was now amplified in this private space. I became acutely aware of his presence, the faint warmth radiating from his arms, the scent lingering in the air whenever he moved past me, the casual strength in every gesture. Marcus set his empty shake aside and leaned back against the couch, eyes never leaving mine. "You're different," he said softly, almost as if testing the truth in his observation. "Not in a bad way. Just attentive. Curious. You notice things most people ignore." His gaze was steady, intimate, and I felt exposed in the most exhilarating way. I swallowed, feeling a mixture of nervousness and desire. "I notice what matters," I replied carefully, aware that my voice carried more than words. Something unspoken passed between us, a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. My mind raced, torn between the life I had with Daniel and the allure of something entirely new. Minutes stretched, and our conversation became punctuated by lingering silences that felt charged with possibility. Marcus shifted closer on the couch, so that the space between us was minimal. Each movement was deliberate yet subtle, calculated to provoke curiosity and awareness. I felt my heart hammering, not from fear, but from a sense of invitation I hadn't anticipated. Then, almost casually, he reached for my hand. The contact was light, fleeting, but enough to ignite a current of heat and anticipation that seemed to surge through my entire body. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The touch was a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had been building since the moment I saw him at the gym. It spoke of curiosity, desire, and a connection that felt dangerously immediate. I glanced away for a moment, forcing myself to breathe. The rational part of my mind screamed caution, Daniel, loyalty, the consequences of crossing lines. But the other part, a part one rarely allowed to breathe, whispered insistently, "Stay. Explore. Feel." Marcus's voice broke the silence, low and inviting. "I know it's sudden, but I'm glad you came." The words were simple, yet their weight was immense. I felt the truth of them in the depth of his gaze, a truth that acknowledged both risk and reward, danger and intimacy. As I sat there, hand still in his, I realized that the night had already begun to shape me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The apartment, the lighting, the subtle closeness. It was a setting that blurred boundaries, made the ordinary feel extraordinary, and demanded a response I wasn't sure I was ready to give. And yet, part of me knew I had already chosen to cross a line, even if I hadn't yet stepped fully into what awaited. By the time Marcus poured us a second drink, I was keenly aware of the delicate balance between temptation and control. Every glance, every gesture, every quiet word contributed to a growing sense of intimacy that was impossible to ignore. The night was no longer just an evening spent at someone's apartment. It was a threshold, a moment where choices and desires collided, where the familiar world of safety and routine felt increasingly distant. And as Marcus leaned back, still watching me, I understood the unspoken truth. Once the door closed behind us, there would be no simple return to the life I had known. The night promised change, and I was already caught in its pull, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to resist. Returning to my apartment that night, the familiar click of the door felt foreign, almost intrusive, as if it no longer belonged to me. Daniel was there, sitting on the couch with a book in hand, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light across his features. He looked up and smiled, comfortable, trusting, unaware. I forced my own smile in return, but it felt thin, fragile, like a mask stretched over a trembling edge. Every step I took toward him was heavy, weighed down by the secret I carried, by the memory of Marcus's apartment, his presence, the electric tension of proximity that lingered in my chest. I tried to act normal, settling beside Daniel, nodding at his anecdotes, laughing when appropriate. Yet my mind replayed the night in fragments. Marcus's laugh, the subtle touch of his hand, the way his eyes seemed to see past all defenses I had built around myself. Even the feel of his apartment's warmth seemed to cling to me, an invisible residue that refused to fade. I felt guilty, undeniably guilty, but the other side of me, the side I rarely acknowledged, buzzed with exhilaration, with desire that I hadn't felt in years. The next few days were a delicate exercise in compartmentalization. I went about my life, exchanged pleasantries with coworkers, laughed at Daniel's jokes, and maintained the facade of stability. But every time my phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, my chest tightened with anticipation and fear. Each text was a spark in a powder keg, flirtatious, teasing, yet carefully calculated to deepen intrigue without revealing too much. I found myself responding with an equal mix of caution and craving, drawn into the subtle game he was orchestrating. By midweek, the initial thrill of meeting Marcus had evolved into a clandestine rhythm. I found excuses to leave early from the office, claiming errands or extended gym sessions, anything that could justify slipping into the world that existed just beyond Daniel's awareness. Every encounter with Marcus was a balancing act, each one reinforcing the tension that had taken root. The secrecy itself became intoxicating, the thrill of being seen in a new light, of inhabiting a version of myself that could exist outside routine, outside expectation. I noticed changes in myself that I hadn't anticipated. My thoughts drifted frequently, and my focus at work faltered. Subtle lapses that Daniel didn't notice yet left me increasingly restless. I grew hyper-aware of time, measuring minutes not by the clock but by the potential for messages, for meetings, for the next stolen moment. The thrill of anticipation was intoxicating, a heady mix of excitement and fear, and I found myself leaning into it even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my conscience. Marcus had a way of making every moment feel significant. Whether it was a casual smile across the room, a text that hinted at plans yet to be made, or the way he laughed at my stories, everything carried a subtle intensity. I realized I was no longer just curious. I was invested. Not in Daniel, not in the stable life I had maintained, but in the possibility Marcus represented. The danger, the attention, the recognition of a part of myself I had long neglected. Yet alongside the excitement, the tension grew heavier with each passing day. I began to notice the patterns of my own duplicity, the hurried explanations, the faint traces of distraction when Daniel spoke, the constant mental accounting of where I had been and why. Each lie, however small, carried a weight that pressed upon me, making the thrill of the affair both more potent and more perilous. I understood, in a way I hadn't before, how easily secrecy could become its own addiction, a blend of fear and desire that neither respected logic nor morality. One evening, after a particularly long day, Marcus suggested we meet at a quiet cafe near his apartment. The air outside was crisp, the city lights shimmering like distant constellations, casting elongated shadows across the pavement. When I arrived, he was already there, seated in a corner booth with a subtle, knowing smile. The moment I slid into the seat across from him, the air shifted. I felt the familiar pull, the magnetic tension that seemed to exist only when he was near. We spoke of trivial things, music, movies, shared memories of mundane moments, but beneath each word lay a current of something unspoken. I noticed how easily I laughed at his jokes, how quickly my gaze found his, how subtly I leaned closer as if drawn by a force beyond my control. Each touch of his hand against mine as we reached for menus, each brush of our shoulders, felt loaded with unspoken promise. I felt exposed, vulnerable, yet exhilarated, as though the ordinary act of sitting together had been transformed into something charged, dangerous, and thrilling. Marcus's eyes held mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "You're different when you're with me," he said softly, a quiet observation that felt intimate in its simplicity. "I can tell you're holding back something, but you're not afraid of me." The words made my stomach tighten, a mixture of anxiety and desire coiling inside me. He was right. I was holding back, trying to maintain a semblance of control, but the magnetic pull between us made restraint increasingly difficult. I left that night with a mixture of exhilaration and unease. The thrill of our secret encounters clashed with the weight of guilt I carried for Daniel. I found myself replaying moments in my mind, the brush of his hand, the subtle arch of his brow, the way his presence seemed to eclipse the ordinary world. Each memory made returning to routine life feel both necessary and unbearable. I was caught between two realities. One that demanded loyalty, stability, and familiarity, and one that offered desire, attention, and the intoxicating sense of living on the edge. By the end of the week, it became clear that my life had bifurcated. Daylight hours belonged to Daniel, to stability and routine. Evenings and stolen moments belonged to Marcus, to tension, longing, and risk. The duality was exhilarating yet unsustainable, a delicate balance that made every decision weighty, every choice laden with consequence. I realized, with a mixture of dread and anticipation, that the longer this continued, the more impossible it would become to navigate both worlds without collision. And yet, despite the danger, despite the growing weight of secrecy, I found myself craving the moments with Marcus more than the comfort of routine. The duality had become intoxicating, a rhythm of temptation and restraint that left me restless, alive in ways I hadn't felt in years. The line between right and wrong blurred, replaced by a singular, undeniable truth. Desire had a gravity all its own, and I was powerless to resist it. As I lay awake that night, replaying our encounters in vivid detail, I understood the unspoken reality of what I had begun. This was no longer an occasional dalliance, no fleeting temptation. The affair had woven itself into the fabric of my life, threading tension, excitement, and guilt into every waking thought. I was suspended in a precarious balance, teetering on the edge of revelation and regret, aware that one misstep could shatter everything I had built. And in that awareness, I knew the story was far from over. The choices I had made had set events into motion that could not be undone, and the next chapter promised both risk and reward in equal measure. The tension that had quietly simmered beneath the surface for weeks finally erupted one evening. I had spent the day juggling my usual responsibilities with Daniel and carefully timed encounters with Marcus, each meeting increasing the precariousness of my dual existence. By the time I returned home, I felt a hollow weight pressing on my chest, a subtle panic that whispered warnings I refused to heed. Daniel was in the kitchen, casually preparing dinner, humming a tune I didn't recognize. He glanced up, his eyes soft, untroubled. I smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach me. There was no warmth, only the aching tension of knowing I had fractured something I had once valued. I tried to act normal, setting the table and commenting on the weather, but every movement felt deliberate, controlled, as if I were performing a part one no longer fully inhabited. Daniel noticed my distraction. "You've been quiet today," he said gently, concern threading his tone. I hesitated, forcing a shrug, but he didn't press further. That small exchange, the almost imperceptible suspicion in his eyes, was enough to make my stomach twist. I realized how fragile the illusion of normalcy had become, how easily a single misstep could unravel everything. Later that evening, Marcus called, his voice smooth, familiar, almost commanding. "Can we meet?" he asked, the simple question loaded with unspoken expectation. My heart raced. I knew Daniel would be asleep soon, that the apartment would be empty, and yet the thought of sneaking away filled me with both exhilaration and dread. I agreed, my voice betraying none of the turmoil churning inside. The city streets were quieter at this hour, streetlights casting pools of amber that seemed to exaggerate shadows and contours, making the familiar feel unfamiliar. When I reached Marcus's apartment, he opened the door immediately, his expression a mix of relief and hunger, as though he had been waiting for me to arrive and knew precisely what my presence meant. The moment I stepped inside, the subtle scent of cedar and spice enveloped me again, instantly grounding and unbalancing me at the same time. We sat together, and for a while, conversation felt casual, almost mundane. Yet beneath each word lay the familiar tension of desire and secrecy. Marcus's gaze lingered longer than necessary, and every touch, no matter how slight, was charged with intimacy. I felt myself pulled deeper into the orbit of temptation, caught between the thrill of the present and the consequences I could no longer ignore. It was then that Marcus spoke with a frankness that left me momentarily breathless. "Alex," he said, leaning closer, "we can't keep doing this like it's nothing. You're splitting yourself in two, and I can see it. I don't want to be the reason you break, but I also don't want to be the one left behind." His words were soft, yet firm, like a tether pulling me toward acknowledgement. I swallowed hard, realizing he was right. The duality I had maintained for weeks, careful deception, measured risk, stolen intimacy, was unsustainable. "I know," I admitted, my voice low, almost ashamed. I didn't mean for it to get this complicated. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting this, even though I know it's wrong." The confession was heavier than I expected, releasing some tension yet amplifying another. Marcus's hand found mine, a grounding touch that sent a shiver up my spine. Before I could process the implications, my phone buzzed insistently. I glanced at it and froze. Daniel had sent a message. "Are you still at the gym? You didn't call." The simplicity of the text made my chest constrict. A cold realization spread through me. This wasn't just a private indulgence anymore. My duplicity was no longer theoretical. It was on the verge of exposure. Panic mingled with guilt, and I suddenly understood the precariousness of my choices. Marcus noticed my sudden stillness and frowned slightly. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern touching his voice. I couldn't answer immediately. Words failed me, swallowed by the urgent knot of fear, guilt, and desire. The temptation that had drawn me into his orbit now clashed violently with the reality waiting for me outside these walls. I have to go," I finally stammered, standing abruptly. Marcus's hand lingered on mine for a moment longer before releasing, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitability of boundaries being tested. I left quickly, the hallway stretching endlessly as if echoing my inner turmoil. Each step back toward my own apartment was a reminder of the life I risked, the trust one had betrayed, and the irrevocable choices I had made. When I walked in, Daniel was standing near the doorway, his expression unreadable. He held my phone in his hand, the screen illuminated with the message thread from Marcus. My stomach dropped, and for the first time, I felt truly exposed, stripped of pretense. Daniel's eyes searched mine, a mixture of hurt, disbelief, and something deeper, betrayal. I can explain," I began, but the words faltered. There was no simple explanation that could undo the tension, the secrecy, the nights stolen from a life I had once cherished. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with pain. "Alex, how long?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything I had avoided facing. I couldn't answer immediately. Guilt pressed against my ribs like a vice, and I realized in that instant how deeply I had fractured the foundation of our relationship. Marcus had awakened a part of me that I had neglected, yes, but in doing so, I had jeopardized something essential, something I hadn't truly appreciated until it was threatened. Tears threatened, and I felt my hands tremble. "Weeks." "I'm sorry," I admitted, the words brittle but honest. Daniel's expression shifted subtly, a mixture of sorrow and disappointment. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He simply turned away for a moment, gathering himself, the quiet gravity of the moment echoing in the room. In the aftermath, the reality of consequences settled like dust in the air. Marcus was no longer present, and the thrill of secrecy had been replaced by the weight of revelation. I felt the full force of my choices, the exhilaration, the desire, the inevitable cost. The tension that had once exhilarated me now pressed down with undeniable weight, a reminder that desire without consideration could destroy what I held dear. By the end of the night, Daniel and I sat in silence, the distance between us palpable. Words failed us both, replaced by the quiet understanding that trust, once broken, required more than promises to restore. And as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I realized the night had changed everything. Not just my relationship, but the way I viewed myself, my desires, and the fragility of choices made in moments of temptation. And yet, despite the heartbreak, despite the consequences, a part of me could not deny the lessons learned. The intensity of desire, the weight of secrecy, and the clarity that sometimes only comes when boundaries are tested and lines are crossed. The story was no longer one of quiet curiosity or idle temptation. It had become a reckoning, and the future, uncertain and tense, awaited the choices I would now have to make.